Hey everybody, how's it going? This is episode 1 of the Gaming the Game podcast featuring myself, Al Zeidenfeld. You guys may know me as Al Smizzle. If you have played daily fantasy before, if you've watched my content on YouTube or on Twitch or anywhere else that I've published content, podcasts, radio, TV, whatever, I decided to come out with this podcast because I've been doing this now, producing content for the better part of a decade, 8 years plus now at this point. I started playing daily fantasy in 2012. I started doing content in 2013. And there's been so many iterations of the daily fantasy industry that the industry has kind of evolved and recreated itself and moved forward, as happens in any young industry or any growing industry, that you pick up more followers, you pick up more viewers, you pick up more listeners as time goes on. And they see where you are and what you are, but they don't know where you came from or how you got to where you're at now. And a lot of people ask constantly over the years, how can I get into content creation? How can I do anything? How can I start a podcast? How can I, get on TV is a different story. How can I write articles for a site? I want to produce content. And I think that we're in a point in time in this society that it's the easiest possible time for anybody to actually just start producing content. All you have to do is download any of the free software that's out there and just click record. Anybody can start their own YouTube channel. Anybody can start their own podcast. Anybody can start their own Twitch channel and start producing or Mixer or whatever, and actually just start producing content, whether it's on Periscope, whether it's on Facebook, wherever it is. Hell, you've got people becoming TikTok famous at this point. It's real easy to just start producing content. But people don't understand the ins and outs of it. So I wanted to talk about and talk to different content creators from a whole bunch of different industries about where they came from and how they got started and when they got their first break and when they thought, you know what, this is turning into something where I may be able to turn this hobby of mine, this thing that I just enjoy doing, into a full-time job. And that's what this podcast is going to be about. The Gaming the Game podcast. For lack of a better term, it's going to be about the origin story of different content creators from a bunch of different industries. I've got some very exciting guests that are lined up to be the first 5 or 6 episodes of this podcast after this episode 1, which is going to be my origin story, where I came from, how I got started, and why. And I think that some of those stories are extremely interesting. And because I get asked a lot, how I got started, where did I work before? I mean, I started a long time ago doing this in daily fantasy, but how did I even get started at that? So I'm going to go through everything that I've done, essentially. I've written this up in an article a couple of years ago on my private site, which I really don't upkeep or anything like that. I've told this story a few times from a few different angles. Some people have an idea, but because you pick up so many new followers as the industry grows, sometimes it's nice to have one place where you can sit back and really understand where a person came from. To really understand who they are differently from the person that you see or read or listen to. Because, look, the person that I am in real life is very close to the person that I am on the air. Especially because I do a lot of live streaming now, it's just me. But it's obviously me kind of with the volume turned up a little bit, because you can't just sit back and be chill and be a little bit boring or whatever. You have to entertain, and you have to get that energy through. I remember when I was on Sirius XM, our producer before every episode used to kind of get into us. Fensterman used to get into us before every episode. You guys ready to bring the energy? Are you ready? Are you ready to jump through that radio? Right? So like that voice is different from this voice that you kind of have to project to get people going. So let's get into where I was before I started playing daily fantasy. I've always done stuff as an adult because I'm an extremely competitive person. So I graduated college. I went to Syracuse University. 1997, I graduated from Syracuse. I got involved in our family business, which was a very boring business, and I was sitting behind a desk every day for 9-10 hours. It was, we sold stainless steel pipe and tubing. It was boring as hell. But I was fortunate enough to be able to invest in certain different things and made enough money to be able to do the things that I wanted to do with my life. And so I was always the type of person to be very competitive. In college, I was always playing intramurals. We were always competing for like the all points championship at Syracuse every single year that I was there. Graduated college, I was playing adult league basketball, adult league softball, adult league, anything that I could compete at. And then after college, and after I got a lot of financial freedom, I decided, okay, I'm going to, I was volunteering coaching at the local Parks and Rec, and then I was getting more into it and starting to really study the craft and try to become a better coach, a better basketball coach. The person that was running the basketball program at that Parks and Rec Center was a college basketball coach, and he was a friend of mine, and he was currently a college basketball coach at the junior college level in Los Angeles. And he had worked at like Georgia Tech when Stephon Marbury was there and a bunch of other places. He saw that I was really starting to get into it and really starting to want to grow as a basketball coach. And he kind of took me under his wing and showed me different videos, different coaching strategies. We started going to coaching clinics all the time so that I could really get after it and get better. And it's like my first job after just volunteering as a park and rec coach and an all-stars coach at a local park was I was a 9th grade girls high school basketball coach. So it's like, there's varsity, then there's junior varsity, and then some schools have a frosh soph or a 9th grade team. I coached the 9th grade team. I made $3,000 my first season. And I had a 10-year plan. I was 25 years old. So I had a 10-year plan that said I wanted to either be an assistant coach at the college men's level, or I wanted to coach a team that was top 5. Or sorry, not top 5. I wanted to coach a team that was in the USA Today Super 25 within 10 years. That was my long-term goal as a basketball coach. So first year, 9th grade basketball coach. Next year, I got bumped up to varsity assistant, and we ended up winning a championship here in California with the school that I was at. The next year, I got offered a head coaching job. I spent 4 years at that job. Then I went to another school, left the head coaching job and went to another school back as an assistant coach. But this was a really good team coming off of like an undefeated season in a state championship. We ended up going 35-1 my year with that school. We won the state championship again. We were top 5 in the nation. I think we had the number 4 team in the USA Today that year. The next year I was coaching college with the guy from the rec center. He was the head coach now, and he brought me on as an assistant, and I was basically in charge of all the inbounds plays. I was in charge of the post players when we did breakdowns and everything else like that. And I spent, 8 years or so doing this professionally. And right about that time, I had choices where I was like, okay, if I want to continue being a basketball coach and keep climbing this ladder, I would have to be like a Division I assistant. And I had opportunities to maybe go that route, but it would mean that I'd have to move around because like when you're a college basketball coach, there's not much job security and there's not much life security. You're going to bounce around. If your head coach gets fired, you got to find another job. You got to find, if you're the third assistant, you got to always be looking for a job the next year, possibly where you can move up to be a second assistant. Or if the first assistant on your team moves, then maybe you're going to move up a spot on the bench. Now you're the second assistant and you climb the ladder that way. But you have to be open to move to all these different places. And I had just bought a house. I didn't want to move. And in the meantime of me coaching, I started taking poker pretty seriously. In the off season from coaching, I was playing online poker. This is 2003 to 2005, 2006. During the summers, I was going to Vegas to play in the World Series of Poker. I was playing some WPT tournaments along the way. I was getting more serious and more serious about honing my skills at that craft because I was pretty all right at it. I was not one of the best players in the world. I'm never going to tell you that. I was not one of the best coaches in the world. I'm never going to tell you that. But I could compete. And that's always what mattered to me. And it matters to me to this day. Anything that I do, I get out there and I try to compete. So poker gave me that outlet, just like coaching gave me that outlet. So after my season at Santa Monica College with Trevor, I had started dating the woman that eventually became my wife, and I didn't want to be moving around. So I said, you know what? I can just play poker. I can do this as a full-time thing. I can spend my hours grinding online, 6 tabling stuff. And then when the once a month or once every 6 weeks that there was a West Coast rotation on a WPT tournament or a tournament in Vegas or whatever, or the ones in Los Angeles with the Bicycle Club or the Bicycle Casino or Commerce, I could play the tournament series there and play some live poker as well and mix that in. It became the full-time thing that I did, and I was always trying to get better at that. Obviously, Black Friday happened with poker. And then we had kids soon after that. And then I was always playing not daily. I was always playing fantasy sports since the time I was 13 years old. And for those of you who don't know, I was born in 1973. I'm 46 years old already. I'll be 47 later this year. So fantasy sports was another way that I would compete, whether it was in our friends and family leagues, which were not really family leagues. They were just a group of friends, but they were hyper competitive leagues, or playing in some NFFC leagues or whatever else I was playing in at the time. I took it quite seriously. And then I was listening to fantasy sports radio on XM pretty much all the time because I was very much into fantasy sports, especially in that little interim between Black Friday and when I started playing DFS. Because like fantasy sports became the thing that consumed me in that time, in that little 2-year gap between Black Friday and the other stuff. So I was playing very seriously. I was taking fantasy sports very, very seriously. I was listening to fantasy sports radio anytime that I was in the car. And there was always these ads for not even DraftKings, Draft Street. DraftKings wasn't even a thing yet. FanDuel, Daily Joust was one of the sites. So baseball season of April 2012, that opening day was when I decided, you know what? I'm going to start playing daily fantasy. And the reason that I started playing daily fantasy was the exact same reason that I started playing poker and that I started coaching. I wanted to test myself. I wanted to compete. Like I always said, I can't hit a Roger Clemens fastball. I can't strike out Mark McGwire. I can't score on an NBA basketball player, but I can sit across from Daniel Negreanu. I can sit across from Phil Hellmuth. I can sit right next to Dolly. And I can play against them and I can compete. And so because I was so immersed in fantasy sports, and I saw and heard all these on-air reads on SiriusXM, that I honestly thought, and maybe it was just me being naive, right, at that time, and I was 39 years old or 38 years old at the time. Maybe I was just being naive that all these guys that are, the hosts on SiriusXM, these Hall of Fame fantasy minds, and they are in the Fantasy Sports Hall of Fame, these guys are probably playing daily fantasy sports on this site, because I couldn't get into leagues like Tout Wars. I couldn't get into leagues like Labor or any of those leagues that I followed very closely and tried to learn how to play for my fantasy season-long drafts. But maybe here's a way that I can compete against these guys, because there's absolutely no barrier to entry with daily fantasy. You could just, hey, the games are there. I can go sign up and play. So I started playing in April 2012, and to my chagrin, there was basically nobody who was on the air who was playing. There was one. It was Tony Sincata was basically the only guy that was playing, and he was playing mostly on Daily Joust. So I'd compete against Tony from time to time, and Rathburn was playing at that time as well, and he'd be a call-in guest from time to time on SiriusXM. But I wanted to compete. I wanted to prove that I knew as much as the hosts that were on these radio shows and that were on television. And so maybe it was ego why I got involved, because I want to see, am I as good as them? But daily fantasy sports gave me an outlet to be able to do that. And I started playing, and we had just had our second kid in 2012, and I started in April of 2012. And as the summer wore on, I kind of, I hit the ground running in April, and you can ask Peter Jennings, he'll remember this. It's like, I was always active in the chat room on FanDuel back then, and during the games, because I'd watch the games and it would just kind of be there, just like I'm active in Discord now. And I just came in firing. Like back then, $109 game was high stakes. The highest stakes you could play for was a $535 head-to-head. And there wasn't even a tournament for that. I think it was like a 10-man tournament for the 535 back then. It was not super high stakes. The biggest prize in the industry that year was like $150,000 for the football championship. And the Draft Street Football Championship was $100,000 to first place. And so I qualified for that first year of football. And I went to the championship in Vegas. It was held at the Bally's. And I came in like 19th out of 20th. There were some big names in that room. Like Drew Dinkmeyer was in that championship. Hicksville Hunk was in that championship. STL Cards, Ben Pritchett, Natural Slugger was in that tournament. There was a lot of guys who were in that tournament that are still in the industry today in one form or another. And some have stopped playing for one reason or another. And soon after that, I qualified, like right after that, in January, I qualified for the basketball championship, which was going to be in like late February or early March of that year, of the next year, of 2013. And my wife basically said to me in 2012, she's like, look, you got 2 kids. And telling your kids that, like, when they go to preschool and people say, what does your dad do? Their answer can't be, my dad plays fantasy sports against people for money. That's not going to come across as a great job, for parents. They're going to just look at you like you're crazy. They're going to look at your kids like, excuse me, what does your dad do? He says, if you're going to do this, you have to do it differently than you did poker, because poker, coming from that world, coming from that background, I clearly understood, or felt that I understood, the directions that a growing industry like daily fantasy was going to go. Which is to say, knowing where people were getting deals with Poker Stars or deals with Full Tilt, doing podcasts, doing content. So it was her idea that, look, if you're going to do this, you have to start writing articles. You have to start writing a blog. You have to record a podcast. You have to do YouTube videos. You have to do something so that it's not just my dad plays games against people. You have to do something that's that's more brand oriented, that you're going to create a name for yourself. So I was approached by a site in 2012 called Re-Up Sports, and they asked me to write articles for them on daily fantasy baseball a couple times a week. I think I made like $20 an article, something ridiculously low for any content creator. Like working for $20 for a piece that you have to write is not a lot. And I remember one of the first articles that I wrote was a comparison of daily fantasy sports to the poker industry. And basically, I said that during this gold rush of the moneymaker effect caused in poker, so there was this land rush to capture all these personalities of people who had already established themselves in the industry. And some of those players in the old days during the World Series of Poker would basically just go to try and make money, because that's what the goal was, right? It's like you're playing poker because you're trying to make money. So all the old heads would go to the World Series of Poker and they would try to get into all the side games because that's where the money was. They weren't grinding the tournaments. But no matter what you think of this one individual, Phil Hellmuth realized that getting to final tables, that winning bracelets were the thing that were going to be lasting in terms of building a legacy. And so when that gold rush happened, and he was one of the guys who had the most bracelets and the most final tables and the most money won at all these different World Series of Pokers, that he was going to be looked at as somebody who had a lot of credibility in this industry and was going to get a lot of offers and deals and whatnot. So I wrote that article and I can't even find it, right? Like Re-Up Sports has gone belly up and I can't find that article. I'm 3 computers past where I was at that time that I wrote that article. I can't find it on my email account anywhere that I sent it to the site to get published, but I'd love it if I could find it on one of these old hard drives that I have, of why it was going to be important and why the big check at that point was the words that I used, was going to be the thing that was going to define a lot of players or separate them from the pack. And making these live finals was like making a final table in poker. And, you know, getting these big checks, winning the biggest tournaments was going to be the thing that was going to separate people. If you could do it multiple times, I called them majors at the time. Now everything's a major. And being a major doesn't even matter at this point. It's just about winning money. It's like, obviously, right? Like there's so much money at the top of these big tournaments now that if you just bink a couple tournaments, you're good for a few years. So I was attacking these live finals and I was attacking these site championships. And we were interviewed by, I think Wall Street Journal came around at one point in time and they said, oh, Al's a big game hunter. He's going after the biggest prizes in the industry. And I was, because I was chasing those, because that's what I thought was important for the path that I had set up for myself as a content creator, because of the path that I thought the industry was going to take very similarly to the path that poker was taking. So I qualified for that basketball final on Draft Street, and it was a very interesting site championship. It was $50,000 to first. Now the basketball championships are like $250,000, $1 million to first. It was $50,000 to first place. It was a 3-day tournament, and it was a survivor tournament. So it started with 30 people, and this field was stacked. You had like Head Chopper had a couple entries, and Dink had a couple entries, and STL Cards was in that one. Everybody was in that tournament. And what year was that article? It was somewhere baseball season 2012. So I win this tournament. It started with 30. You had to be in the top 20 to make day 2. You had to be in the top 10 to make day 3. I had the top score in day 1. I just survived day 2. I think I came in 8th on day 2 and made the final. Then I ran away with the championship. It was over with like an entire fourth quarter to go because there was a blowout and nobody else had anybody playing. So I ended up winning that. And it was a Bulls Golden State game, and I forget who blew out who. But all the starters sat, and I'm sitting there in the Draft Street chat, and people are congratulating me for winning the tournament. And that led to an appearance with Dan Bach on the Daily Fantasy Fix podcast for rotogrinders. He immediately emails me, congratulates me, asks me to come on. I record the podcast with him. And about a week later, Dan announces that rotogrinders is going to start doing a live broadcast every day, 5 days a week, you know, where they were going to talk about the top plays before lock. About an hour or two before lock, they were going to go live, and it was him and Soccer Dave that were going to be the hosts. And I remember emailing Dan, and I basically said, look, I think I'd be good at this. It was mid-March of 2013. I said, look, you just interviewed me. I won the basketball championship. I love talking about sports. And I think that this would be something that's right up my alley. If you could give me a trial, that would be greatly appreciated. And there was no proof of concept yet. There was no show yet. There was no anything yet. But I was, based on what I wanted to do, I thought that this was going to be very important for me and for, you know, air quotes here, right? But like my career as a analyst or whatever, a personality in daily fantasy sports. And it was right along the lines of what I wanted to do. And so I noticed that there was a hole, right? And my zone philosophy in coaching basketball goes through to every other, you know, there's a lot of things in team sports that translate to other opportunities in life. And so my zone philosophy of attacking a 2-3 zone, or any zone for that matter, is to, one, make the zone move. And then where they vacate, you fill. So if you can make the forward in a zone pop out to the 3-point line to go guard the ball, somebody else who does not have the ball needs to move into that vacated space that defender just left, because now you're the most open person on the floor. You vacate, they vacate, we fill. Then we pass the ball into that vacated area. Now somebody else has to move to cover, and they're going to vacate another area, and then you move into that vacated area, and we get a dunk. Very simple basketball philosophy. And so I saw that there was a hole. There was a vacated space on every channel for somebody who understood how to play the game of daily fantasy and had success in daily fantasy sports and could talk about it on air. Cleanly, intelligently, however you want to put it, right? And here come the comments, right? Quote, yeah, Al's talking cleanly and intelligently, but a little bit, but not a lot. And I noticed, because I was watching Fantasy Football Now every weekend before I was setting football lineups, because that was the only show anywhere during 2012 football season that was at all relevant to daily fantasy sports. But there was no talk about daily fantasy sports at all. But they were doing their rankings, and then I would know what the salaries were and say, oh, interesting, they've got these players ranked here. This guy is the number 3 quarterback on their consensus rankings, but he's like priced as the 12th quarterback, so I think that maybe this guy's, I need to look more into him as a value play today. It's very rudimentary. It's before any lineup optimizers or projections or anything else like that. But it worked. And I realized that there's a hole here. There's a vacated space. And I decided that I wanted to be the guy on ESPN who talked about daily fantasy sports, because they did not have a guy on ESPN talking about daily fantasy sports. And where I thought the trajectory of that industry was going to go, there was going to be a demand for somebody to do that. And so why shouldn't it be me? Now, much like The Martian, which is one of my favorite movies, not my top 5 movies, we'll get into that maybe on another episode or down the road, but like, it's one of my favorite movies. Not because, cinematography or the special effects or anything like that, or it's more because to go from being stuck on another planet to getting back home to Earth. And the middle was kind of underpants Nomi. Right? So we got step 1, we're stuck on Mars. Step 3, we're safe at home on Earth. Step 2, question mark. And that was essentially where I was. Here I was, some guy who had just emailed a person that I just met and did one podcast episode with, that nobody knew who I was outside of, the few hundred people, or apologies, Dan, if you had more than a few hundred downloads at that. Maybe you had a few thousand. I'm not trying to slight the podcast, but the industry was small back then. So the few hundred people who had any idea of what my name was at that time, to being the guy on ESPN on Fantasy Football Now talking about this. And the middle was a big question mark. So in The Martian, he had to go through all these little steps. First, he had to figure out, he had to heal himself, right? Because he got injured. Then he had to figure out, I have this much food. How am I going to get food? Then he had to figure out, okay, well, I need to go somewhere else. I need to communicate to let them know that I'm here. Then he had to go further out and try and get battery life so we could get to this other site. There were all these little problems that he had to solve along the way so that he could get to that point where he'd have the opportunity to get home. So here I was, nobody knew who I was, and I had this big goal of I want to be on ESPN because I'm insane. I'm just a crazy person, I guess. And the way that I thought to get there, I need to get on Grinders Live. I need to get a reel. I need to have footage of me doing this stuff. I need to get on SiriusXM on a show, whether it's a regular guest is calling, or maybe if rotogrinders gets a show on SiriusXM, I have to be that guy. that's on that show so that I could be counted as a reputable person in the industry by people who are in the industry. I thought that site sponsorship of players was going to come down the pipe, which means like PokerStars has PokerStars Pros, and Full Tilt had red deals for players where like this player's name would be different and singled out as this is a verified player, or this is a, you know, they're partnered with Full Tilt. And I thought that was all. These are all the things that I thought I had to accomplish. And I need to do all these different things so that I could be maybe a little bit more palatable, with ESPN being the ultimate goal for what I wanted to achieve. And maybe you'll get there, maybe you won't. So Grinders Live was the first domino. And Dan lets me get on Grinders Live. They give me a trial. I was awful. Like if you want to scroll back on rotogrinders YouTube page to like 2013 and find like those first few shows from March that I was on, I was awful. I wasn't being myself. I was trying to be this other thing on the air and it didn't work. Instead of just relaxing and just kind of being stupid and trying to entertain people and give them some sort of information and make jokes and calm down and not be stiff and all these other different things. Eventually I got there. I started doing stupid things with toys and other songs, and it related very well. People liked it. Grinders Live got a drive time radio show before lock, 5 days a week on Sirius XM. And I was positioned through my spot on Grinders Live to be with Dan on the radio on Sirius XM. That happened in 2013. We move along. At the end of 2013, every site had $1 million prize pool for their championship. FanDuel was first in week 14. I did not qualify for that live final. Draft Street was second in week 15. I did not qualify for that live final. But I covered both live finals for rotogrinders. So I was there working. Week 16, DraftKings had their first millionaire maker. And they went the entire weekend at that point in time. So the games were from Sunday morning. I'm on the West Coast, so it's morning to me. Sunday, 1 p.m. East Coast kickoff games, all the way through the end of the Monday night game. I know that the slates are different now. They have a main slate, then a Sunday night and a Monday night. Back then, it was all the games except for Thursday night. So for the main slate. Long story short, I come in second place. I lose that tournament by 0.5 points. And I had a very, very, very good year in 2013. I was winning most of the things that you could win in baseball. I had won the basketball championship in March. And DraftKings had announced Rotogrinders announced a player of the year. This was their second year of doing it. The first year that they did it was the year before. And they voted for it. This was the first year you had to compete for it and play for it. So your top 10 scores counted. It's obviously changed since then. And I was in position to do all right at it. And if I win that tournament, I'm like, I'm going to win. And that video actually exists on YouTube of the night they filmed it. It was me and this other dude. And we actually showed up at a bar because we're both from Los Angeles. He ended up winning. His screen name was Boonda Fever. Nice dude. But you can see the moment that like Frank Gore scores a touchdown where I was up 5.5 points and Frank Gore scores a touchdown to put him up 0.5. And I lose by 0.5 points in the first millionaire maker. And all I could think was everything that I've worked for just flew out the window. I had a chance to be the first millionaire maker winner. If I won the millionaire maker, it would have made me the tournament player of the year in 2013 on Rotogrinders. And all this stuff, I'm like, if I win, I get all this stuff. And if I lose, I don't. It turned out that I was wrong, because second place gave me enough points to take down the player of the year, which at that point for me in my career, I thought was huge. And in January, I get contacted by Jason Robbins from DraftKings. He says that they're putting together a collection of players on the site and personalities that they want to be the face of the site. So site sponsorship was now, just like Full Tilt, just like PokerStars, was a thing that was coming to fruition. And I had positioned myself, even though I didn't win that Millionaire Maker, even though I came in second, right? I won $350,000. In my mind, I didn't win $350,000. In my mind, I lost $650,000 and all these massive opportunities. That's all I could think of in that moment. But he said, look, we're coming out with this thing and we want you to be a part of it. And Peter Jennings is going to be a part of it. And Jonathan Bales is going to be a part of it. And I respected those dudes. And I was like, yeah, sign me up. How can I be in? And so I got the site sponsorship. And I had been on SiriusXM now, on Drive Time. And I had plenty of reel on this Grinders live show. And so things moved. We went through 2014. The beginning of 2015, I'm in Vegas for the FSTA, which is now the FSGA, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association show, the convention. It was in Las Vegas at the Bellagio. And I had met Matthew Berry in passing, which is to say that he probably didn't know my name back then. But like maybe a little. Like he was aware that I was a human being who existed. But I wasn't friends with him. I didn't have like his number or anything. I DM'd him and asked if there was somebody at ESPN that I could talk to, possibly. You know, is there somebody you can set me up with? Maybe I can submit a resume. I'd like to be the DFS guy. Or if there's going to be a space where you guys are talking about DFS, I want to be that guy. And he set me up with the head editor of the fantasy department, who I met at this, and his right-hand man, who I met at this FSTA. And I got to give them here's a bunch of the videos that I've done. Here's the podcast that I've been on. I'm on SiriusXM. I actually had, at this point, a resume in 2015 of January of something that I could do. You know, this is the things that I've done in the daily fantasy industry. Here's me on air. Here's me on the radio. Here's me on video. Here's me talking about advice. Here's the 2-minute drill videos that I was doing. Not unlike the first look videos that I do now, but they were only 2 minutes. It was like, let's get some stuff out there. That was the length of content that people did at the time, that they thought was the right amount that people would actually listen to. And so in 2013, when I said that ESPN was the goal, I was told I was crazy, that ESPN is probably not going to get involved. Maybe that's something that could be a stretch goal down the line, maybe 5 or 7 years down the road, is what I was told in spring and summer of 2013. In August, I was running a site called Daily Fantasy Bootcamp at that time, and we were doing live shows across the country, 3, 4, 5 of them for every sport in different cities. And I was in Atlanta. And Dan Bach was on that one, and Peter Jennings was on that one, and JJ Zachariason and Davis Maddock we were the 5 speakers at that Daily Fantasy Bootcamp, talking about various things for football. It was in the middle of August. And I get a phone call, and it pops up, and it's a gentleman named Andrew Feldman from ESPN, who was working in the fitness department then. He works in a different department now. He works in the combat sports department now. Boxing, UFC, wrestling, whatever else. And I answer the phone immediately. Hey, what's up? He says, we're a go. When can you be here? I said, whenever you want me there, I can be there. Not a problem. Just tell me where I'm staying. I will get on a plane as soon as I'm back home. I'm in Atlanta right now. And I talked to Dan, because I called Dan. We're at the VIP part of the thing. We're at a Braves game in a luxury box. I called Dan out. I called Pete out, because Pete was going to do the ESPN stuff as well that year. And Dan says we got to do like been on Grinders Live since the beginning. We got to do like an exit show. We got to do a farewell show, which was amazing. Fantastic experience, at least for me. I hope it was well received back then. And my first appearance on the Oak 6010 podcast with Matthew Berry and Stefania and Field was September the 2nd of 2015. So 2.5 years from the point that nobody knew who I was on the biggest fantasy football podcast as a guest that existed in the world at that time. My first week in Bristol was September 29th. It was week 3 of NFL season 2015. I was going to ESPN every other weekend. Pete would go one weekend, I would go the next. I was on SportsCenter on Sunday morning, and it was literally the only time that I've ever been nervous. We filmed all these different SportsCenter things, and I was working with all these different hosts, and it was fun, and it was great, and I was never nervous. And then we're live on Sunday morning, and my producers would always let me know who the host was going to be, and you get like a show sheet beforehand. You're going to talk about this, you're going to talk about these players, here's how they're going to toss it to you. There's going to be video, or there's going to be pictures. Just have a conversation and say the words. Sure. You don't get a script, you have to speak, but you have an idea of what you're going to talk about. That was the only one that I did not know who my host was going to be, that I would be working with. And I'd worked with a bunch of people. I'd worked with Eves. I'd worked with Matt Berry. I'd worked with Randy Scott. I'd worked with a bunch of different guys at ESPN at that point. And I think it was week 5 that I came back, and I'm on the big SportsCenter set. I'm sitting there at my little side desk, and walking across the room, here comes Linda Cohn to talk to stupid me about fantasy football. And that was legitimately the only time I've ever been nervous in front of a microphone, in front of a camera, was when I realized that Linda Cohn is going to be the person that I'm working with this morning. The queen of SportsCenter is walking across the set, and I'm going to have to talk to her live in front of millions of people. Gulp. How am I going to pull this off? Anyway, I stumble through that segment. It was like the worst segment that I'd ever done on SportsCenter. I was legitimately nervous. The only time I was ever nervous was just because I'm working with Linda Cohn. Like, it finally became real to me that here's the thing. I got to where I wanted to go. I got to ESPN. I'm on SportsCenter on Sunday morning talking about football in front of millions of people. And that was the road that I took to get there. Obviously, there's been other steps along the way that have been things that I've done that have been great. The Daily Fantasy Edge podcast was a huge thing for me. I always felt that was a fantastic podcast, one of the favorite pieces of content that I had ever put out. I started doing podcasts or started doing live shows on Twitch. I believe it was 2017 was the thing that I wanted to do. I said, look, I think that this is another vacated space. This is a place that I think that people are going to go, is to live streaming on Twitch, and nobody in the fantasy community is there. So I'm going to be there, because where they vacate, you fill. And I started doing live shows on Twitch. And then I said, okay, I'm going to start exporting these shows to YouTube just so maybe they'll sit there. And that is the biggest regret for me of my content producing career, is that I didn't really take YouTube or have as good of an understanding of what YouTube was and what YouTube meant and what YouTube can be at that point in time. I really didn't. I was extremely ignorant in terms of the reach and the depth and everything that YouTube could provide. So I was just kind of throwing videos up. Like, if you go back on my main channel and go back to the beginning of what I started posting, it's like I didn't even have thumbnails. My tags were a mess. The description didn't make any sense. The videos were just, I was like, okay, I'll just cut this segment out and I'll throw it up on YouTube. Right? Here's some stuff that's somewhat relevant. I'll just put it on YouTube, and if people want to watch it later, instead of watching it live on Twitch, they can watch that. But the truth is, YouTube is the funnel. YouTube is a search engine, as it is owned by Google. And so it is the thing that will drive traffic to your other content. You're going to be tapped out on the people that follow you on Twitter if you just try and send them to stuff. Twitch is a destination. They have to know that you're live. There's not much discovery on Twitch, right? It's very hard for somebody to stumble upon you on Twitch. Much harder than it is for them to stumble upon your work on YouTube, because of all the work that YouTube does to classify and identify your video as something that people might want to see, and they put it up in front of them. If you have a snappy thumbnail, they're going to click it because it looks really nice. So me not realizing that in 2012 and not really fully understanding it until maybe halfway through football season of 2017, and missing out on 5 years of growth is probably the biggest mistake that I've made as a content creator, is not really fully understanding the depth and the scope of what YouTube can mean to a content creator. And now I've been putting content on YouTube for about 3 years, and my channel's grown to a respectable number. I'm happy with the channel, and hopefully it continues to grow, and hopefully this channel grows as well. But what could have been if I was producing YouTube content in 2012 and 2013 versus starting in 2017 is probably the biggest mistake I made and my biggest regret for what could have been. But that's just nitpicking, really, because in all honesty, how could I possibly complain about the places that I've gone and the things that I've done and all the experiences that I've had as some knucklehead that nobody had ever heard of in 2012 in this space, in the fantasy industry, to being the guy with the article on ESPN, on the 06010 podcast, weekly spots on TV. You know, you're not going to get everything right. It's impossible. Hindsight is always going to be 2020. But like, if I could do one thing differently, that would be the main thing that I would do differently. I would have focused earlier on producing content on YouTube and or Twitch to try and grow my audience, to be in a higher leverage spot now versus before. And I've had help with YouTube as well, from some friends, one of whom I'm going to be interviewing on this podcast, Nepenthes, in the coming weeks. And there's been other people in this industry who have used YouTube to their advantage greatly. Somebody else I would love to have on this podcast, Andy Holloway from the Fantasy Footballers. And they attacked YouTube. They did a fantastic job. And their growth has been absolutely massive. And I can't wait to get to talk to those guys and have them tell their origin stories and their pratfalls and things that worked for them and things that they wish that they had done differently. So I hope that you've enjoyed this podcast. If you would be so kind, please drop a review on iTunes or give it a thumbs up on Stitcher if you're watching this on YouTube. All the videos will be hosted on the on my second channel, Al Smizzle Games. So drop a subscribe on this channel, ring that notifications bell, drop a like on the video. And there was one quote that I want to leave you with on this podcast today. There are hundreds of paths up the mountain, so it doesn't matter which path you take. The only one wasting time is the one who runs around the bottom of the mountain telling everybody else that their path is wrong. So get out there, do something, have some fun. We'll catch you next time on episode 2 of Gaming the Game.